is Scott Hanselman. And Scott is a web developer who has been blogging at hanselman.com for nearly 20 years. He works in open source on ASP.NET and the Azure cloud for Microsoft. And Scott has podcasted at Hansel Minutes for nearly 800 episodes, over 15 years. And he's also written a number of books and spoken in person to over 500,000 developers worldwide. We're glad to have you here today, Scott. I'll hand over the stage to you and your talk, Linux on Windows is real and is spectacular.
There we go. Hello, friends. Had to have the boss unmute me there. Thank you very much for spending time with me today. Right now it's about 7 in the morning where I'm at, and I realize that it's a little later in the day for you. I'm excited to be chatting with you today. I hope that we've going to see some great content and are having fun at the conference. I am going to be talking about Linux on Windows, which is one of my favorite topics. Now, I happen to be running Windows 11, and I'm going to try to do everything here entirely as demos and conversation rather than showing any slides, because developers don't like to see any slides. I've got a freshly built Windows 11 machine. You can do a lot of the things that I'm going to show you on Windows 10, but Windows 11 will give you the best experience for a number of reasons that I'll go and show you. I'll also talk a little bit about the Windows terminal and setting up your environment to look as nice as possible. And we'll be zooming in and looking at some settings, and then we'll also do some Q&A as well. So let's take a look at my screen here and switch to the screen. We'll probably want to stay on the screen as long as we possibly can. All right, so to start out with, again, we're on Windows 11, and I've turned on Windows Terminal, which comes with Windows 11. And Windows Terminal here has a setting where you can actually set the default terminal application. Now, I realize that this talk is about Linux on Windows, but we're going to talk about the concept of the terminal a little bit because it's important, and a lot of things have changed. You see where it says default terminal application. You might wonder what the previous terminal application was. Well, that was a thing called the Windows Console Host, the Windows Console Host. So if I switch that setting and hit save, and then I'm just going to run cmd.exe, you'll recognize this terminal. And this can be a little bit confusing because we're using a lot of different words, and it sometimes seems like we're using different words to mean the same thing. Terminal, console, shell, prompt. This can be a little bit confusing, and it gets more confusing on a machine like this when you start adding in a lot of different prompts. So I'm going to open up Notepad here, and we'll just talk about those words for a little bit. Terminal, console, prompt, shell. It gets a little bit blurry. So that word terminal is a really interesting word, and I've actually written a blog post about it that I'll bring up from another screen, and I'll bring up over here, because the terminal is the terminating end, or the terminating end of something, and the terminating end of something was used many, many, many years ago to refer to terminals like this. These are actual physical terminals. You would sit down at a terminal, you would have your input here, right? Your input is the typewriter, and then your output would be the paper on the typewriter. This would be like a terminal that speaks to a mainframe. So when we think about what that terminal, or that TTY, that teletypewriter, TTY is a term that we hear sometimes when we think about the history of these things. That is connected to some host, some backend host, that terminating end, that TTY, that teletypewriter. But the console within the context of Windows, that console is responsible for painting. Responsible for painting. And I say painting because we're talking about whose job is it to decide which font we use. For example, here we have the original older console host for Windows, and you'll notice that we've got choices like fonts and font size. And of course, that doesn't have anything to do with PowerShell or DOS or Bash or your shell. It's really just something that the console decides how it's going to go and paint that stuff, all right? And this dialog box is very old. And this terminal, this console here is incredibly old. This has been built into Windows for, gosh, 20 or 30 years, right? And it has all kinds of historical baggage. We've, I think, as developers, spent a lot of time here, and we've had frustration with the way it resizes and the speed of it and the inability to use ligatures and new fonts. There's no tabs, there's no toolbar, there's no configurability. So console host has been around forever, and it will be around forever, but it will be de-emphasized. So in Windows 11, you'll have the ability to choose your default console. And by default, I mean, if I just type PowerShell or I just type CMD, what's going to happen? So if I switch that to Windows Terminal and I just run cmd.exe, you'll see that it pops up in another tab in the Windows Terminal. So we're having a much better experience. And you'll see that I have additional tabs up here just by changing that setting. Right now, it's not set like that by default, but in the future, we expect to see that set by default. The only reason that you would want to set it otherwise is for compatibility reasons. So what's interesting about that is that this command prompt, this CMD prompt, is responsible for writing out this string, but not painting it. And then we've got this cursor waiting. So then we have an interesting separation of responsibilities. That prompt might be C:, it might be a $, it might be a PowerShell prompt. And that's going to be dictated by the shell that we decide to use. And there's lots of shells, right? There's CMD and there's PowerShell, but Linux users are familiar with things like Bash and ZSH and Fish and SH and Ash and on and on and on and on and on. So the shell is the thing that's going to take your inputs and run your scripts and express sometimes a prompt. But in recent years, we've also seen those prompts be configurable. So we have prompts like "Oh my posh" is the name of a prompt. And Starship. Starship is the name of another prompt. Then when you add in things like operating systems, it gets even more confusing. So the reason that I'm talking to you about all this stuff and expressing that there's a difference between the concept of a terminal, the console that's responsible on Windows, the prompt that it chooses to show you, the shell that you're going to do your interpreted scripts and your input on, and then the operating system is there's what's called a Cartesian product, right? It's a cross product of all of these different things. So you're going to come upon Windows machines where you might have a third-party terminal. You might have ConEmu or Commander or Console Z. You might have Windows Terminal. You might have ConHost. So we're at a moment now in Windows and Windows development where we have an unlimited amount of choice, and it can be a little overwhelming. So understanding these words, terminal, console, prompt, shell, and now operating system, makes things a lot more interesting than it ever has been, but also potentially a little bit confusing. So if you're on Windows 11 or a newer version of Windows 10, you can type WSL -- install, and that will set up your system for the Windows subsystem for Linux. And it will allow you to have the ability to run Linux applications on your Windows machine. And then once you can do that, a lot of interesting stuff opens up, a lot of possibilities as a developer, because oftentimes we'll find ourselves on Windows developing, but we'll be deploying into a Linux container, something in the cloud. That's my typical experiment and my typical way of doing things. And then we have WSA, there's WSL and there's WSA, which is coming soon. And you can see it in preview, which is the Windows subsystem for Android. And that I also have on this system as well. And we'll talk about that as well. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. So I'm going to close this terminal here, and I'm going to move away and open up our Windows terminal. And we'll notice right off the bat some interesting stuff. You can see that it is got acrylic, so it's nice and see-through. I've got a drop-down menu here, which is very, very interesting, that has a lot of the different choices that I can have. Classic Windows PowerShell. This one that's bold is my default prompt. I use PowerShell by default. And then we have the little tux Penguin here with my preferred Ubuntu. In this one, it's a little bit older. I tend to run an older Ubuntu. They're on version 20.04 now, and I think there's a 21.004 that is not an LTS or a long-term support release. We've got the classic command prompt for your batch files and things like that, and then Azure Cloud Shell. You can edit this list of consoles. You can put whatever you want in here. So if I go to settings, we can see this profile choice of shells, and I can add a new profile. And profiles can be anything that you want. And this, again, is where it gets a little bit confusing. So for example, we might have on our machine, let's see if we have git bash. Here we go. So git bash is installed when you put git on your Windows machine for the first time. And git bash was installed for historical reasons because using Windows was confusing to people that were using git. So look at this. This is a strange little prompt, isn't it? Let me go ahead and minimize Windows Terminal. Let's explore this for a second. If I click up here and I click Options, notice that it doesn't look like anything we've seen before. It doesn't look like conhost, the console host that came with Windows. It doesn't look like Windows Terminal. It looks like its own thing. It's using a thing called min-tty. Remember that TTY is that teletypewriter. So this is a alternative console host. And this was created because Windows was moving so slowly and the console host in Windows was so poor historically that they couldn't print out the things that they wanted to print out, like ANSI and ASCII and Unicode, and have the way, the configuration the way that they wanted it. So the question is then, if we use what we learned about prompts and consoles and terminals, what pieces here can be explored and potentially brought into our Windows terminal? Because git bash, if we say open file location and go explore it, that's going to pop up on another machine. Here we go. That's over here. I'm going to go ahead and right click and say properties. And we'll look closely at this. I'm going to actually bring that into Notepad so we can see it larger. Okay, look at that. So git bash is a program that I could configure and add to my Windows terminal. So I could go over here to Windows terminal, could add a new profile, maybe make a new empty one. I could call it git bash, put in the command line here. Here's git bash. I could make it have a custom icon and whatnot, things like that. Now here we're getting an error. Let's go and explore that. There's a couple of ways that we can do that. We can try to debug it here, or I can open a JSON file, and that'll actually give me a JSON expression of my settings. So I'm looking at my Windows terminal settings, and you can see down here, git bash has been added. And it might be confused about the starting directory. It might be confused about that argument on the end there. It totally depends. So let's take a look. I'll remove that argument and we'll try it again. So you have a lot of really interesting stuff going on in this space and a lot of people trying new things. I'm going to make a change, hit save. Try running git bash again. It's mad at me about something. If I try running it directly from here, actually, I think I wrote a blog post about this. One of the great things about blogging for a very, very long time on the internet is you go and write blog posts about stuff like this in order to find them yourself. So I may have written a blog post or someone else one. Here we go. Someone else wrote a blog post for me. So -- login. Oh yeah, it was in bash. Forgot about that. So this is a great example where I've even gotten confused, and this is good for us to understand when we get to the WSL stuff. So git bash is actually the min-tty program. And if we go deeper inside of the Git software that was installed with Windows here, we'll go into program files, Git, and realize that even I, while explaining this, got confused because it isn't actually git bash that I wanted. It's this bash.exe. Isn't that funny? So program files, git bin, I'm going to right click. I'm going to say copy as path. We'll go back here, paste that in. This is the difference between running the console app and running the graphical app, which was the thing that was responsible for painting that we talked about a moment ago. There we go. Let's return. There we go. All right. So here we see where we have added an alternative shell to Windows Terminal. In this case here now, instead of running it into that min.tty, that different terminal, we're running it here. But is it really bash? Is it really bash? Well, it says bash.exe. It's got git. It's got an alternative shell called sh, and it's got bash. I can type ls. That's Linux, right? Wrong. This is not Linux. And people sometimes will say, I don't need WSL. I don't want the Windows subsystem for Linux because I already have my own, git bash, I don't need WSL. I have git bash, or I have Cygwin. Now what these are is user mode applications. These are user mode apps. They're actually the GNU utilities that have been recompiled for Windows. So what that means is these are the Win32 versions of bash. So here, that's my Windows C drive. So what you're getting here is the Windows operating system, the bash experience that you may be used to from a command perspective. But, can I run top? No. Can I run awk? Yes. Why? Because they have included just the command line things that you would need to run your bash scripts. So this isn't Linux, it's Linux-y. It's Linux-like. It gives you the feeling of Linux on Windows. That's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing, but we need to have our eyes wide open to understand, again, the difference. We've got that terminal and that shell and that operating system. So the Windows terminal is the one we're using now. We've just added git bash to the Windows terminal. So then the question is, do I want bash on Windows because I have bash scripts? Do I want PowerShell on Windows? Do I want, DOS? If git bash works, which is like Cygwin, that's great. If that makes you comfortable. But if you're trying to target Linux, then you're going to want actual bash, and that's where WSL gets in. So if I come out here and I say WSL -- install, that will go and install all the things that you need. And this also works on Windows Home and on Windows Pro. So if you have a Windows Home SKU at home, this will work for you. We worked very hard to make sure that students would have access to this because not everyone has Pro. And then if you already have it, you can type WSL -- list -v, V for verbose. And you can see here that on this fresh machine that I built, I have Ubuntu. I have a little star that's showing me that that's my default WSL, and then it's running. And then I have two helper ones here for Docker, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, remember that I mentioned that the Windows terminal was going to populate my menu here, and it already populated Ubuntu right there. Now you can, I haven't actually tried this before, but I'm told that you can actually go WSL -- install and ask for specific distributions. Here we go. And I can go and say I want a certain distribution. So WSL -- list, let's say -- online. Ooh, look at this. So let's get Debian. WSL -- install -d Debian. So we're on Windows in the Windows terminal, and just because we felt like it in the middle of our talk here at this wonderful conference, look at that. We are installing Debian. Let's put in our, username and password. This is going to be a new one. There it is. Now I'm going to return back to my prompt here. I'm going to type wsl --list. And you'll see now I have Ubuntu as my default and the newly installed and running Debian. So I can have as many of these as I want. You can see that these are the ones that are available online. Those are actually coming from the Windows Store. And the Windows Store in this context is just being used as a way to ship tar files around, to ship tar files around. So what we did is we just downloaded Debian as a tar file and then unzipped it into a virtual hard drive, and now it's being run by the Windows subsystem for Linux. I can run SUSE, I can run Ubuntu's old and new, Kali Linux, or I can bring my own. I actually brought my own by using import, and I brought it from a backup that I had, because this is a fresh machine. I wanted an Ubuntu that I had set up for development before, so I said wsl -- import. You can go and export your favorite distribution or even create your own. There's a lot of really great folks online that have a very rich ecosystem of utilities to make WSL even easier and more fun. So now we've got Debian. I'm going to close the Windows terminal here, and I'm going to launch it again. And we're going to notice as I bring the Windows terminal over from another monitor, that Debian just showed up in the profile here. So we see auto-generated profiles as well as manually generated ones like the git bash one that we just invented right here. So right now I've got classic PowerShell, PowerShell core, which is my default, my Ubuntu, the Debian we just added, and git bash, which is the bash on Windows that we added ourselves manually. That becomes really interesting when I can do something like holding down Alt. Right now I'm going to use my left thumb and I'm going to hold down the Alt button and I'm going to say Debian. And now I've got Debian on the right and I've got Windows on the left. I could then hold down Alt again and I could click on Ubuntu. And now we've got Ubuntu now in the lower left corner here. And I've got PowerShell, Ubuntu, and Debian all kind of hanging out together. And that is giving me an ability and a flexibility that I didn't ever have before. Isn't that cool? You can actually go to the Windows Store. I'm going to bring up the Windows Store. And again, that's probably going to pop up on another monitor. Here we go. And I'll bring that over. And install the Windows subsystem for Linux from the store if you want, and you'll get more regular updates. It's built into Windows 10 and Windows 11 now, but by putting it into the store, that means that they can actually rev it and update it with new features. And what's great about having the Windows subsystem for Linux in the Windows Store is they've added already new features. So if I say WSL -- help, I can see that one of the new features that I believe was added recently was the ability, here we go, look at this, to attach and mount a physical dist. So that means if I have a USB key that's got a Linux file system on it, like an ext4 file system, I can go and mount that. Or if I happen to have a VHD around from another Hyper-V VM or another virtual machine that I've had in the past, I can go and mount that and take a look at it, which is really cool. So you're really getting physical access. There's also talk of the ability to have like USB devices and things like that. And I've written on my blog how to connect to IoT devices as well using WSL1. So if you want to read about that, you can check that out on my blog. All right, cool. So right now in the Windows terminal, you'll note that I've gone and added a PowerShell logo in the corner. And that's just a graphic that's floating over my profile. Each profile can have a background. You can have backgrounds and colors because I needed to be able to tell the difference between Windows and Ubuntu. So I'm going to actually do that split screen again. And you'll notice something interesting. I've got a custom prompt here, and that might be a little distracting, but it makes me happy. And I've got the same exact prompt in both Windows. Here's Windows. Oops, no, this is PowerShell. There you go. There's how you can tell it's PowerShell. And we've got me over here in Ubuntu. So I'll say LSB release -A. And I've put the Ubuntu logo down in the corner there. That way I can tell things apart. And I've also given it the Ubuntu color scheme so I can tell where I'm at. But I've really customized these this prompt. You'll notice as I'm typing, I'm getting different drop downs and I'm getting history. I've got details on how to set that up in a lot of detail on both my blog and on my YouTube. But I'm going to go into a folder here on GitHub and my C drive on my Windows machine. And you'll notice that my prompt changes to show me the current folder. It shows me my current Git branch that I have 3 modified files that I'm using .NET 6. And then I've got a little heart here that's telling me whether or not there was an error the last time I was doing anything. Let's look at Git status. I've got some small changes here. Let's say git revert, put this back the way it was. Or git reset. I always forget that. There we go. So now you can see that I don't have 3 modified things anymore. Now this is on Windows. So I'm going to say .NET run. .NET run. I got to spell .NET right. And it's telling me that there's not a project to run. That's because I'm in the root here. I'm going to go down 1 folder. .NET run. Again, this is on Windows. Oh, what are you complaining about, silly? I don't think I updated this to .NET 5 yet. So this is an interesting unrelated .NET issue. What we're going to do here is I'm going to say .NET -- info. I'm going to see the versions of .NET that I have. You can see here I've got the .NET 5 SDK. I'm going to say .NET new global JSON to make sure that this thing will build on the version of .NET that I'm interested in. I'm going to change the version in my global JSON to version 5. So when I hit enter now, you're going to see that now this folder is version 5 rather than version 6. Try .NET run again. It's going to go and compile my podcast website for me, hopefully. Might need to go and do some restore as well. For the first time, again, this is a brand new machine. There we go. So here, you'll notice that the terminal is actually underlining these URLs. So I can click on the URL that appears within the text right there, which is really cool. So when I click on that and I bring it up on another monitor, now I've got localhost 5000, right? And I'm looking at that particular website. So that's my podcast website here on localhost 5000. What if we hit Control C, we switch over to Ubuntu, right? In another tab, and it could be another split screen, it could be another tab, it could be whatever. I need to update my profile because I've got some scripts that are running in there that are hanging, that are slowing me down a little bit, and that can be a little bit frustrating. That'll pop in just a second here. There we go. I say .NET run inside of Linux, okay, inside of Linux on localhost 5001. I'll bring that up on another monitor. Here's my website's homepage using the Hanselman page instead of Hansel Minutes. And again, I'm on localhost 5001. That becomes really interesting because we're on Linux. Is this another machine or not? It has its own name, right? It is its own thing. If I say host name, well, that's weird. That's my Windows machine's name. If I say ifconfig, only at this point can we see that the IP address is 172 something here. So we have an IP address that's specific to my Ubuntu machine. But if we go and say ipconfig over here in the Windows world, see, we will notice my 192 here, that's my actual address. And we'll see that the networking is being handled in the WSL, the Linux world, virtually using Hyper-V. Now, this is not a Hyper-V VM, but it's rather a small, tiny utility VM. It's being used by WSL, and that's why the Linux systems start up so fast. What we can do, though, is we can figure out how are we.
I couldn't understand, but I may have a few recommendations.
Go away, Alexa. Go away.
There's a skill called Area Security Systems.
Alexa?
Would you like to try it?
Alexa, be quiet, please. Thank you.
Sometimes Alexa
Okay.
just talks too much and you need some peace and quiet.
Yeah, that's
Do you
annoying.
want to try it?
Go away. That was dramatic. Alexa was feeling like she wanted to get involved in the conversation here. So over here in Linux, we have this localhost 5000 and localhost 5001. We're listening in on localhost, but it's clear that we have multiple machines here. Let's open up Tcp View. Okay, Tcp View is a utility that comes with sys internals. And let's look at our port situation and figure out what's going on here. Who's listening on what and who's responsible for doing this kind of work? So maybe we can sort by local port, figure out what's happening. I might need to run this as administrator. Because who's actually listening is WSL host. Now this is a new, actually let me open that up again because I need to be running .NET Run. Let's see if we can see it happen in real time. That'd be cool. Oop, there it is, there it is, there it is. All right, so we just ran our application in Linux, in Ubuntu, and WSL host.exe started listening both IPv4 and IPv6 on ports 5000 and ports 5001. And that is a Windows process, right? So what's happening is Linux starts to listen on a port, and then WSL port forwards in a way and has a different process responsible for doing that. And that means that my browser, my local Windows browser, can listen on localhost. Why would you want to do that? Because it makes the experience very natural. That means that I can just drop into Linux. I can go and run Node or Python or .NET, and I can listen on localhost, and I can be rest assured that it'll work. And I can move smoothly back and forth between Windows and Linux. Speaking of moving smoothly back and forth, if we take a look at our file system, we'll notice that I'm on the Linux file system here, home Scott Hanselman. But if we look at things over here in Windows, we're in C, GitHub, whatever, right? So there are different file systems here. Linux on Windows has its own entirely separate file system. But because we don't want it to feel like a virtual machine, we don't want to make it so you start up Hyper-V and you go into the desktop. You want it to be seamless. You want it to feel like Windows. I can actually go and run explorer.exe, a Windows executable in Linux, hit enter. That's going to pop up probably on, there you go, on another machine or another screen. I've got so many screens here. And look at this. Here's the source code for the folder that I'm looking at right now. And we're on wsl.localhost. So I'm inside Explorer looking at the Ubuntu file systems. You can even see the Debian instance that we just started up before. I can go and move around and see all of my files and folders. I can even run Homebrew. Mac people might be familiar with Homebrew. There's Homebrew for WSL now. So if you're a brew or Homebrew person, you can take a look at Linux Brew and take a look at Homebrew. That's a thing now. What's cool about this is not only do I have full access to these files, I could open them up in Notepad if I wanted to. I could open them up in notepad.exe. And notepad.exe also supports line feeds. I'm using, in fact, Notepad 2 here, which is my preferred one. And I can see down here that it's using line feed rather than carriage return line feed. So Windows itself is smarter about Linux text in this context. And then you'll notice that I ran explorer.exe. That gets really, really weird. What's cool about this is I can run Windows executables as long as I give them a .exe extension. And that means you can make really interesting scripts. So your scripts now that are on Windows machines that have WSL can run Linux and Windows executables at the same time. So for example, I could say ls, which of course is a Linux thing. I could say ls a log f and get a long form, or ll, and then I could pipe that through a Windows executable and then pipe that through a Linux executable. So you can make really cool, sophisticated automation scripts that it'll enable you to do this work. And you'll notice, of course, that I've been able to move smoothly between doing .NET development on Linux and on Windows. I can get even farther and go into, let's go on our Linux machine actually to Hansel minutes. I went and I wrote in this folder PowerShell scripts for Docker, as well as a Docker file, so that I can use Docker for Windows, which ends up using Linux. And that means that I can use Docker in both environments. Go and build my podcast website in Docker. There you go. Throw that up into the cloud as well. That is using WSL under the hood, which is really, really cool. Another thing that is exclusive to Windows 11, as far as I know, is the ability to run graphical apps, right? So let's do this. There's a thing called WSLG, and let's install like the GIMP. I actually wrote a blog post about this. And we can go and run the GIMP under WSL. So let's go back to Linux. The GIMP is like Photoshop. Sudo apt install, is it a sudo install GIMP? Okay, so we can run the GIMP. And what's going to happen here? Again, too many monitors, stuff popping up all over the place. I can actually open up another folder. We could try to install something fresh as well as I wait for the GIMP to start up. There it is. So here is a Linux application running on Windows. I can install any application that makes me happy. I can even install different IDEs. And when I say File Open, you'll see that the dialog box here looks like Linux because it is Linux. It's running natively though on Windows. This is not X Windows. It's using a thing called Wayland. And I can open stuff up and edit it or whatever. I could even use an IDE if I wanted to, which brings us to some really interesting stuff that one could potentially do that blurs the line between Linux and Windows. So let's go back to my home folder and let's go back to that Hanselman folder. And I could certainly install like a JetBrains IDE, or I could go and run Vim or something like that and run it underneath WSL, or I could type code and run potentially Visual Studio Code, except this is the Windows version of Visual Studio Code. But you see here it says opening remote. Visual Studio is going to split in half. It's going to split in half, and it's going to have the Windows subsystem for Linux run the Visual Studio Code server, and then the client version will run on Windows. So I'm actually running the Windows version of Visual Studio Code. I could return over here to Linux and run htop, and I could go digging around and I could find you not only Docker Desktop, but here, VS Code server running locally on Linux. And then as I go file, open file, you see the Linux path right here. So I can go and open my C#, look at my code, make changes, write stuff. And when I get IntelliSense, I'll get IntelliSense that is specific to what's going on here. That language server is running in Linux, which means I can run Go and Python and Node and all the different things that I want to run. And again, move seamlessly between the two. And if I decide to open up a terminal, here I am in Windows, in the Windows version of VS Code, running my C# app. And now I've got my terminal with my custom prompt down here. And I've got htop or top or whatever makes me happy. This has allowed me to use the operating system that makes me happy, that I like. I like Windows. I've used Linux since it existed, and I've used Unix machines since before that. It allows me to customize my terminal the way I want it. I can run tmux, I can run screen, I can run whatever I want. I can run Docker, I can run graphical applications, I can run games, and then I can even go potentially, like I said before, and run Android apps as well. So if I wanted to run the Microsoft Store, then from the Microsoft Store, you can have other sub-stores, and then I could go and run, one of these games. So we've got not only the Windows subsystem for Linux, but also the Windows subsystem for Android. So I'm imagining a world very, very soon where I'm going to be able to go and run, develop and run Android apps on Windows, test them locally, have them talk to Docker containers that have microservices, deploy them up into the cloud, basically be able to do all of that development locally. Here's the Amazon App Store inside of Windows. I'll go and I'll hit install here on Subway Surfers, which is an Android game. And then if I was developing that game, I would run it locally in Visual Studio or Visual Studio 2022, then have it talk to the backend services that could be running in Kubernetes or running in Docker or whatever. That'll then show up in my start menu. You can see that Debian and Docker and everything are all showing up in my start menu. And now Subway Surfers just appeared in my start menu. So I have a Linux app, Windows app, Android app all together in the start menu. And then when I go and run it, now I've got an Android application running right there in Windows. So Android, Linux, Visual Studio, Terminal, all next to each other. I think that's my time, and we'll maybe do some Q&A now. But I thought that went pretty well. I like it when we do things entirely live. So if something breaks, we talk about why it breaks, and we can fix it, which is great. So let's turn it over to our host, and they can join me and maybe ask some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Scott. That's really interesting. And we've gotten one question for you, and it asks, should I run VS Code as a Linux graphical application or with the WSL remote extension?
That's a great question. So I personally prefer to run my Windows apps as Windows apps. Of course, VS Code is a cross-platform application. I have never had any issues running it as a Windows app and using the remote. You'll notice here, if we share my screen again, that you have the ability to open folders both in Windows and WSL. So if you run it as a Windows app, you can have a foot in each world. So I would probably recommend running the Windows one until it doesn't do what you need it to do. Again, if there's an app you can only find on Linux, or there's some Linux tool or Linux IDE that you prefer to use, you could even use something like Graphical Vim. Then you can use that and run it as a graphical application, but I don't think it's necessary. So I would probably stick with the Windows one. Here, I'll just go as an example, and I'll install, a GTK version of Vim. You can see that I'm just using the same Linux commands as before. This is the same way that you would install Visual Studio in Linux if you wanted to. I think it'd be a little bit confusing if you did that, but totally up to you. And then if we were going to go and run that version of Vim, whatever command we would need to use, I can't remember if it's gvim or not. There we go. So that's going to pop up. I'll bring it over from my other monitor. You'll notice that Linux applications appear in the Windows taskbar, and they have a little tux, a little penguin next to them. So that's the way that you tell your things apart. So you can run Linux browsers, you can run Linux editors, and then do that work there. So it's really up to you, but I would say that the answer is for Visual Studio Code, just run the Windows version. Good question.
Thank you so much. And now we take a quick break and we're back at 4 o'clock.